It was a cloudy afternoon in London, the kind of day when the sky looked heavy and gray and the air carried the smell of old stone and rain. Karoline Leavitt stood outside Buckingham Palace, her camera hanging around her neck, surrounded by tourists who were all trying to take pictures of the royal guards. She was a young journalist from America, always curious and full of energy, the kind of person who wanted to understand everything by seeing it up close. The palace, with its wide gates and grand walls, felt like a place from another time. Soldiers in bright red uniforms and tall black hats stood perfectly still, not moving even an inch. People laughed and waved at them, but the guards never blinked. To Karoline, it looked strange. She had grown up in a country where people spoke freely, laughed easily, and questioned everything. To her, the idea of standing still for hours, showing no reaction at all, seemed like an odd old rule that had lost its meaning. She watched one of the guards carefully. He was tall, with broad shoulders and calm eyes that looked far away even though he stood right there. His face showed no emotion. Karoline tilted her head, curious. She wanted to write an article about how the British Guard never breaks. She had seen hundreds of short videos online where people tried to make the guards laugh or move. Most of them failed. It looked funny, harmless even. She thought maybe she could get a small reaction too, just for the story. It wasn't about being rude, she told herself. It was about learning what discipline really looked like. But deep down, she also wanted attention. She wanted her story to stand out. The crowd around her was full of tourists with bright jackets, phones raised high, and children pointing in amazement. The guards stood in a perfect line, rifles resting on their shoulders. A little boy in front of Karoline waved his arms and shouted, but the guard didn't move. His focus was absolute. Karoline smiled to herself. "He's not even human," she whispered softly, almost as a joke, but a woman beside her frowned. "They're soldiers," the woman said gently. "They take it seriously." Karoline nodded, but still didn't fully understand. She decided to step a little closer, her sneakers crunching on the gravel as she moved past the other visitors. A metal barrier kept people from getting too close, and she stopped just behind it. Her camera light blinked as she focused on the guard again. Through her lens, she could see how still his breathing was. He didn't even look real, like a statue carved from stone. The rain started to fall lightly, small drops on her hands and hair, but the guard didn't flinch. Karoline wondered what kind of training it took to stay so still. A voice inside her head said, "Maybe he's told not to move no matter what." Another part of her whispered, "But why follow such an old rule?" She had always believed that speaking up, laughing, and moving freely were signs of being alive. She thought maybe this kind of discipline was just another way to hide human feelings. She wanted to see what would happen if she pushed that idea, just a little. She looked at the crowd again. People were laughing, some taking selfies. Nobody seemed to care about the seriousness of the moment. It felt like a show, not a ceremony. So she lifted her camera again and called out softly, "Do you ever move?" Her voice carried over the murmur of the tourists. No answer came. The guard stood still, his eyes forward. She smiled and tried again, louder this time. "Come on, just one smile." Still nothing. The crowd turned their heads toward her now, a few curious faces watching what she would do next. She felt a small thrill in her chest, the kind of feeling reporters get when they think they might capture something unexpected. But something inside her also felt uneasy. She could sense that the guard's stillness wasn't stubbornness. It was something else, something rooted deep in respect. Yet her pride wanted to see if he would break the rule. Without really thinking, and half laughing, she said, "Sit down." "Boy." The words slipped out like a quick joke, but the sound of them was sharp in the quiet air. The laughter stopped. A few people gasped softly. Even the wind seemed to pause for a second. The guard didn't move right away, but something changed in his eyes, just a small flicker of life behind that unshaken face. Karoline felt her smile fade. She hadn't meant it to sound disrespectful. In her head, it was a playful challenge, not an insult. But hearing her own voice echo made her realize it had come out wrong. For a few long seconds, nothing happened. The guard stayed still. Tourists looked at each other in confusion, unsure whether they had just witnessed a mistake. Karoline's fingers tightened on her camera. The silence pressed against her like a heavy weight. She could hear the distant hooves of horses from the palace courtyard and the clicking of another tourist's camera somewhere behind her. Then slowly the guard's head turned toward her. The movement was so subtle yet so powerful that the crowd froze. Everyone knew these guards were trained not to respond, not to move no matter what happened. Yet here he was looking directly at her. His eyes met hers, steady, calm, and full of something she couldn't name. Not anger, not pride. It was something heavier. Karoline swallowed hard. For the first time, she didn't know what to say. She lowered her camera slightly, her heart pounding faster. She could see now that he wasn't just a performer standing for tourists. He was a soldier, a man with a purpose. His uniform wasn't for decoration. It was a symbol. The tourists around her waited, whispering softly. Some held up their phones, ready to record. A man muttered, "He's not supposed to move." Another replied, "He just did." The air felt tense. Karoline's mind raced through excuses. Maybe she should say sorry, maybe she should walk away, but her feet stayed still. The guard took a breath, slow and controlled. She could hear it in the quiet. Then his voice, deep and steady, broke the silence. "Ma'am," he said, his accent calm but firm. "I stand here not for you." The words were few, but they cut through her thoughts like a bell ringing in a silent hall. She didn't know what to reply. The guard turned his head back forward, resuming his position as if nothing had happened. The crowd stood silent for several moments, unsure what they had just witnessed. Then the whispers began again, and people slowly moved back to taking pictures, their laughter quieter now. Karoline stood frozen. Her fingers trembled slightly as she turned off her camera. The air around her felt heavier than before. She realized that something important had just happened, something she couldn't yet put into words. It wasn't just a tourist moment or a funny clip for her story. It was a lesson forming right in front of her eyes, though she didn't yet understand what it meant. As the rain grew stronger and the crowd began to thin, Karoline stayed there for a while, staring at the guard who had returned to silence. He hadn't shouted, hadn't scolded her, hadn't done anything except remind her of the difference between curiosity and respect. She walked away slowly, the sound of her footsteps mixing with the soft patter of rain. She didn't know that the brief moment she had captured on her camera would soon travel farther than she could imagine, or that his calm reply would become something millions of people would talk about. But for now, all she felt was a quiet shame and a growing respect for a man who stood in silence, stronger than any word she could write. The sound of rain slowly faded into the background as Karoline stood there, her heart still beating fast from what had just happened. The moment when the guard turned his head toward her kept playing again and again in her mind. His voice, calm and deep, still echoed in her ears. "Ma'am, I stand here not for you." Those words were short, but they carried something powerful that she couldn't explain. The crowd had already moved on. Some people were whispering about the scene. Others were looking at their phones, probably watching the video they had recorded. Karoline tried to focus her thoughts, but her mind felt clouded. She looked at the guard again. He was back in his still position, standing straight with his rifle against his shoulder like nothing had happened. For a few seconds, she thought about walking away and pretending it was nothing. She could still write her article as she had planned, maybe turn it into a funny piece about how strict the royal guards were. But something stopped her. The way he had looked at her wasn't angry. It was steady, like he was teaching her something she had never learned before. It made her feel small but also thoughtful, the kind of feeling that comes when someone quietly reminds you of a truth you've ignored. The light drizzle turned heavier, and most of the tourists began to leave the area, running toward the shelter of the shops and cafes nearby. Karoline, however, stayed where she was. She stood under her small umbrella, her camera now hanging by her side, forgotten for a moment. The gray clouds above the palace looked almost silver as the rain slid down the iron gates. Every droplet seemed to echo softly in the empty courtyard. The guard did not move, his uniform now wet but still perfectly neat. Karoline whispered to herself, why would anyone do this every day? She thought of how he must stand there for hours, not moving, not speaking, while hundreds of people laughed, shouted, and tried to break his focus. It seemed impossible. She remembered how she had called him boy and felt her stomach twist with guilt. It had sounded wrong even to her own ears. Maybe she had been too used to seeing authority as something to challenge, not something to respect. A small group of tourists came running back, laughing and shouting in the rain. One of them, a man in a blue jacket, stopped near her and said, "You're the girl who talked to him, right?" Karoline turned toward him, unsure how to answer. The man held up his phone. "It's already online," he said, grinning. Someone uploaded the video. You should see the comments. It's blowing up. Her heart sank. She hadn't expected anyone to record her. What do you mean? She asked softly. The man showed her the screen. There she was, standing in front of the guard, saying the words that now sounded even worse when heard again. The caption under the video said, "American tourist mocks Royal Guard. His reply shocks everyone." The video already had thousands of views. Karoline felt her chest tighten. "That's not what I meant," she whispered. But the man had already walked away laughing. She turned back toward the guard, who was still in position, silent and strong. People around her were watching him differently now. Not as a tourist attraction, but as something more serious. The energy of the place had changed. Even the laughter that had filled the air earlier seemed softer now, respectful in a way. Karoline realized that this man, by doing nothing more than standing still and speaking a few honest words, had turned a moment of foolishness into a lesson for everyone there. She stood quietly, her umbrella trembling in her hand. The more she thought about it, the more she wanted to understand. Who was he? What kind of person could live like this, standing for hours in rain or heat, ignoring jokes, photos, and noise? She knew that the guards were trained soldiers, but seeing it this close made it real. It wasn't just tradition. It was something deeper. After a while, one of the guards further down the line changed position, marching with sharp, rhythmic steps. The sound of his boots on the wet ground echoed like a drumbeat. Karoline watched closely. Every motion was perfect, every move synchronized. There was no hesitation. The tall guard she had spoken to didn't even blink as the changeover happened. His focus didn't waver for a second. Something about that silence felt almost sacred to her now. It wasn't empty, it was full of meaning. She thought about the words he had said and how simple they were. "I stand here not for you." He hadn't needed to explain more, yet those words opened 100 questions in her mind. Who did he stand for then? His country? His comrades? The fallen soldiers? She realized that every minute he stood still was not just part of his job. It was a kind of silent respect for people she didn't know and stories she hadn't heard. She stepped back toward the railing again, trying to catch his face between the falling raindrops. His eyes were calm, looking forward as if he could see something beyond the palace gates. She wondered what kind of life he had outside this place. Did he laugh? Did he have a family? Did he ever feel tired of people like her trying to test him? The more she watched, the smaller she felt. Then she heard a soft voice beside her. It was the same woman who had earlier corrected her. "You know," the woman said kindly, "they train for years to stand like that. They serve in wars too. This is not just a show." Karoline nodded quietly. "I didn't mean to disrespect him," she said honestly. The woman smiled a little. "We all forget sometimes," she replied. "Respect isn't always loud. Sometimes it's silent." Those words stayed with Karoline. She stood there until the palace guards began their slow, formal march toward the courtyard gate. The sound of boots on wet stone echoed like a heartbeat in the rain. People started clapping softly, some removing their hats in quiet respect. Karoline clapped too, but her hands felt heavy. She wasn't cheering for entertainment. She was clapping for understanding, for the strange, powerful calm she had witnessed. When the guard she had spoken to disappeared inside the gates, she finally turned to leave. The rain had soaked her shoes, her clothes, and her camera bag, but she didn't care. She walked down the long street, her mind spinning. She thought about writing her article again, but now the story would be very different. It wouldn't be about how hard it was to make a guard move. It would be about how easy it was to forget the meaning behind that stillness. She stopped at a small cafe across the road and sat near the window, watching the palace through the misty glass. Her reflection looked tired, thoughtful, and not as confident as before. She opened her laptop and began to type. The first words she wrote were, "I thought he was silent because he had no choice, but now I know silence can be stronger than words." As she typed, she realized that her small mistake had turned into something she would never forget. The video of that day might spread for all the wrong reasons, but the truth of what she had learned would stay with her longer than any headline or social post. Somewhere behind those palace walls, a soldier stood quietly again, keeping watch, and Karoline, sitting in a warm cafe with a cup of tea, finally understood that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is to say nothing at all and still speak to the heart of the world. The next morning, the sky over London was bright but cold, and a soft wind moved through the streets. Karoline woke up in her small hotel room near Hyde Park. her mind still replaying the words she had heard the day before. The moment with the royal guard had not left her. It was as if his calm voice had followed her into her dreams, repeating again and again, "I stand here not for you." She lay there for a long time staring at the ceiling, thinking about what he had meant. The world outside her window was busy, filled with cars, people, and noise, yet what stayed in her heart was his quietness. That silence had more weight than any speech she had ever written. When she finally got up, she opened her laptop expecting to start her usual morning routine. But as soon as the screen lit up, dozens of notifications flooded her screen. Her social media accounts were full of messages, tags, and mentions. The video from yesterday had spread faster than she could imagine. Her name was everywhere. Headlines called her the American tourist who challenged the royal guard. Some comments defended her, saying she was just curious, but most were angry or disappointed. People wrote that she had disrespected a soldier, that she didn't understand British tradition, that she had crossed a line. Karoline's heart sank as she scrolled. She hadn't wanted this. It was supposed to be a small, funny story for her travel column, not something the whole world would talk about. Her phone buzzed again. A message from her editor appeared on the screen. "Karoline, the video has gone viral. People are upset. You might want to write your side before it gets worse." She stared at the message, unsure of what to do. The thought of writing scared her now. Every word she typed could be judged, twisted, or misunderstood. She closed her laptop for a moment and sat by the window, watching a group of school children walk past below. They were laughing, running, full of energy. Life outside looked normal, but she felt like she had been placed under a bright, unkind spotlight. She took a deep breath and whispered to herself, "Maybe I should talk to him." The idea startled her, but it made sense. She wanted to understand the man she had spoken to. Maybe if she could find him, she could learn who he was, why he said those words, and what they truly meant. She put on her coat, grabbed her notebook, and left the hotel. When she reached Buckingham Palace again, the area was already crowded with tourists. The morning light made the palace gates shine, and the soldiers were back in their positions, standing as still as ever. Karoline moved slowly along the fence, scanning the guards one by one. She wasn't sure which one he was. Their faces looked similar from a distance, all serious, all calm. But when she looked closely at the guard on the far left, something in his posture felt familiar. She wasn't sure if it was him, but she stayed there anyway, her heart racing. She waited quietly, not speaking this time. She didn't want to make a scene again. The tourists around her were taking photos, but she just watched. Every few minutes, the guards moved in a perfect rhythm, their boots clicking on the stone ground. Time passed slowly. After what felt like an hour, she saw an officer approach the guard she thought was him. They exchanged a few words, then the guard began walking away toward the courtyard. Her chance was slipping. Without thinking, she followed him. She walked along the side of the palace where visitors were not allowed to go, stopping near a small archway where a few soldiers were standing off duty. One of them looked at her curiously and asked, "Can I help you, miss?" Karoline smiled nervously. "I'm looking for the guard who spoke to me yesterday," she said softly. The soldier raised an eyebrow. "Ah," he said, glancing at his friend. "You mean the one from the video?" She nodded. He sighed. "He's not allowed to talk to the press, miss. You might want to go through the official channels." "I don't want an interview," Karoline said quickly. "I just want to say thank you. Please, just 1 minute." The soldier hesitated, then looked over his shoulder and whispered, "Wait here." A few minutes later, the same tall guard from yesterday stepped through the archway. Without his bearskin hat, he looked younger than she remembered, but his eyes were exactly the same, calm, focused, and kind. He stopped a few feet away from her, standing straight even though he wasn't on duty. "You came back," he said quietly. His voice was steady but not unfriendly. Karoline nodded, her throat tightening. "I wanted to say I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't mean to disrespect you. I thought I was being clever, but I was wrong." The guard looked at her for a long moment, then said, "I know. People forget sometimes. You didn't hurt me, but words can carry weight even when you don't mean them to." She nodded, feeling her eyes sting. "You said something yesterday. You said you stand here not for me. I keep thinking about that. Who do you stand for?" He looked past her for a moment, his gaze settling on the gray sky above the palace. "For the ones who can't stand anymore," he said softly. "For the men and women who served before me, and for those who never came home. Every minute I stand still, I remember them. That's why I don't react. That's why I stay silent. It's not for show. It's a promise. Karoline didn't speak for a while. The street noise faded in her mind as she tried to take in his words. That's beautiful, she whispered finally. He smiled slightly, a rare softness breaking through his disciplined expression. It's not always easy, he said. People laugh, take pictures, try to get a reaction. But every time I want to move, I think of a name, a friend, a brother, someone I trained with who never made it back. I stand for them. Karoline felt tears roll down her cheeks. She didn't bother to hide them. I didn't know, she said. I never thought of it like that. I thought it was just tradition. He shook his head gently. Tradition has meaning when it carries respect. Standing still isn't about obedience. It's about remembering. They stood in silence for a while. The sound of distant footsteps echoed from the courtyard. The rain had stopped, and a pale sunlight fell across the palace walls. Karoline finally said, "People are talking about you all over the world. They keep sharing your words. Do you know that?" The guard gave a faint smile. "I don't read much online," he said. "But if they heard something good, then maybe it was worth it." She reached out her hand to him. "Thank you," she said softly. He hesitated for a moment, then shook her hand with a steady grip. "Take care, Miss Leavitt," he said, "and write something that helps people understand, not just react." When he walked away, Karoline stayed there, watching him disappear into the palace courtyard. For the first time, she understood that silence could be a message stronger than any speech. It wasn't weakness. It was dignity. She walked back toward the street, her notebook heavy in her bag, her heart full of something new. She knew now that she couldn't just write another travel story. She had to write the truth. The truth about respect, service, and what it means to stand for something without saying a word. That evening, as the city lights came on and the palace shone golden in the distance, Karoline sat at her desk writing her new story. Her words were simple, honest, and full of feeling. She didn't try to make herself look better. She only told what she had seen and what she had learned. By the time she finished, tears had dried on her cheeks and she felt lighter. The story wasn't just about a guard or a tourist. It was about understanding, how sometimes the strongest people are the quiet ones and how one calm voice can remind the world of what really matters. The evening lights of London sparkled against the wet streets as Karoline walked slowly back to her hotel. The air was cool and the smell of rain still lingered in the air. Every sound around her seemed distant, the cars, the chatter, even the city itself. Her heart was quiet, filled with the words the guard had spoken to her earlier that day, for the ones who can't stand anymore. That single sentence had changed everything inside her. It was more than just an answer. It was a mirror showing her what she had forgotten: respect, humility, and the weight of silent service. When she reached her hotel room, she placed her camera on the table and sat down near the window. The soft yellow light from the lamp glowed on the pages of her notebook. Her laptop was open, waiting for her next words, but she didn't start writing right away. Instead, she stared at the blinking cursor and thought about the man she had met. His steady voice and quiet strength stayed with her like a melody that refused to fade. She could still see the way he stood tall, even when the world around him moved fast and loud. She began to type slowly. Each sentence came from her heart, not her mind. "I met a man who said nothing, yet taught me more than any teacher ever did," she wrote. "He showed me that silence is not weakness and stillness is not emptiness. It is a promise, a memory, and a kind of love that doesn't need words." She stopped for a moment, tears filling her eyes again. She wasn't writing for fame or apology anymore. She was writing because she had to share what she had learned. Hours passed. The lights outside dimmed and the sound of London softened to a hum. By midnight, she had written thousands of words. It wasn't just an article anymore. It was a story about humanity, sacrifice, and understanding. She titled it, "The Man Who Stood Still." When she read it back, her voice trembled, but she felt peace. She clicked send and emailed it to her editor. The next morning, she woke up to dozens of new messages. Her editor had already published the story, and people were responding faster than she expected. But this time, the comments were different. Readers weren't angry or mocking. They were moved. Many shared their own stories about soldiers, family members, and loved ones who had served quietly and bravely. Some wrote, "This made me cry," while others said, "Now I see them differently." For the first time in days, Karoline smiled. The story wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who had ever misunderstood silence. Later that afternoon, she decided to visit the palace again, not as a journalist, but as a person who wanted to say goodbye properly. The crowd was smaller that day, and the air was bright and fresh after the rain. The same line of guards stood at their posts, still as ever. She searched for the man she had spoken to, but she didn't see him this time. A new rotation had taken over. She stood by the gate quietly, her hands folded in front of her, feeling a mix of pride and humility. She noticed a small boy standing beside her with his father. The boy was about 8 years old, holding a small flag in his hand. He looked up at one of the guards and whispered, "Why don't they talk?" His father smiled and said softly, "Because they're honoring others who can't be here anymore." Karoline felt her throat tighten. Those same words carried the same meaning she had learned just a day before. It made her realize how fast lessons can spread, how one moment can change how people see the world. A few minutes later, a palace official walked by and noticed her. He stopped and said politely, "You're Miss Leavitt, aren't you?" Karoline nodded nervously. "Yes, that's me," she said quietly. The man smiled. "I read your story. It reached many hearts, including ours. The guard you spoke to, he read it too. He asked me to thank you." Her eyes widened. "He read it?" she asked softly. The man nodded. "He doesn't like attention, but he said your words were fair. He said you listened." Karoline's heart warmed. "Please tell him thank you," she said. "He changed me more than he knows." The man nodded and walked away, leaving her standing there in the golden afternoon light. She watched the guards again, feeling a quiet respect she hadn't felt before. Every still figure in red uniform was now more than just a soldier to her. They were symbols of devotion, patience, and courage. They weren't just guarding a palace. They were guarding history, memory, and the unseen sacrifices of countless lives. She spent the rest of the day walking through the streets of London, her thoughts calm and full. The city felt different now. She noticed small details she had ignored before. The kindness in a shopkeeper's smile, the sound of footsteps on cobblestone, the way strangers helped each other cross the street. The world didn't feel like a race anymore. It felt like a story full of people quietly standing for something they believed in. That night, she received an unexpected email. It was from a British veteran who had read her story. His message was simple but full of emotion. "Thank you for reminding people why we serve," he wrote. "It's not for praise, it's for memory. The guard's words were perfect, and so were yours." Karoline read the email several times, her hands trembling slightly. She felt grateful. Grateful for the mistake that had taught her something beautiful, and for the man who had shown her the meaning of quiet strength. In the days that followed, her story was shared across newspapers and television programs. People quoted the guard's line again and again. Schools discussed it in classrooms. Even across the ocean in America, people talked about it on the news. "I stand here not for you, but for the ones who never came home," became a line of respect, a reminder of sacrifice and gratitude. Karoline received invitations for interviews, but she turned most of them down. She didn't want to speak for him. She wanted his silence to remain powerful. When she finally did appear on one show, she said only this: "That guard didn't move because he didn't need to. His silence was louder than any argument, stronger than any speech. He reminded me that respect is not something you demand, it's something you give." After the interview, she went back to her hotel and stood by the window, looking out over the city lights once again. She wondered if he was still standing guard somewhere behind those palace walls, tall and quiet as ever. Maybe he was. Maybe he always would be, and maybe that was enough. She whispered softly to herself. Some people speak through words, others speak through silence. Her story had come full circle. What began as a careless challenge had turned into a lesson that reached the hearts of thousands. The world had watched her mistake, but it had also watched her learn. And somewhere inside the walls of Buckingham Palace, a soldier had taught a young woman, and an entire country, what honor truly meant. As she closed her curtains and turned off the lights, Karoline smiled. She didn't need applause or fame. She had found something better, understanding. The silence she once mocked had become her teacher, and in that quiet she found peace. The morning sun shone gently over the London skyline, and the world was already wide awake with talk about the story that had captured so many hearts. Karoline Leavitt's article had traveled across oceans, printed in newspapers, shared on television, and posted all over the internet. People in cafes, classrooms, and offices were reading her words and listening to the guard's calm reply. What had begun as a tense and embarrassing moment had turned into something that united strangers around a simple idea: respect. Back in her hotel room, Karoline sat by the window with a warm cup of tea. She looked out at the streets below, where tourists were beginning to gather again near the palace gates. For the first time since she had arrived in London, she felt peaceful. The noise outside no longer felt like chaos. It sounded like life moving forward. Her phone buzzed constantly, full of new messages and interview requests. But she didn't rush to answer them. She wanted to take in everything slowly this time. She had learned that not everything needed to be said at once. Her article had reached America overnight. Her friends from home had sent her screenshots and headlines. News anchors in New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles were quoting the guard's words on live television. "I stand here not for you, but for the ones who never came home." Those few words had touched the hearts of veterans, families of soldiers, and everyday people who suddenly found new meaning in silent acts of service. Schools began to discuss the story in their classrooms, teachers asking students what they thought the words meant. Some said it was about bravery, others said it was about memory, but most said it was about humility, something the world had forgotten. Karoline opened her email again and found hundreds of messages. Some were from strangers thanking her for sharing the story. Others were from soldiers who said they felt seen for the first time. One message came from a mother in Texas who wrote, "My son served in the army and never came back. When I heard that guard's words, I cried. Please thank him for reminding the world that our children are not forgotten." Karoline's eyes filled with tears as she read that. She wished she could tell the guard how far his words had traveled, how much they had healed. Later that day, she walked back to Buckingham Palace once more. The sky was clear and blue, and sunlight reflected off the gold edges of the palace gates. Crowds of visitors were already there, but this time the atmosphere felt different. People were quieter, more respectful. Tourists stood still for a moment before taking pictures. A group of students from America stood near the railing holding small flags, and their teacher told them, "Remember, this isn't a show. These men are soldiers." Karoline smiled softly. It was working. The message was spreading. She stood by the same spot where she had spoken those foolish words days before. The memory still stung, but now it also brought gratitude. That single mistake had taught her something she could never have learned in any classroom or newsroom. It had shown her that true understanding often comes from moments of humility. After a while, she noticed a familiar figure approaching the gate from inside the courtyard. It was the same guard, though now off-duty, dressed in a simple uniform without the tall bearskin hat. Their eyes met for a moment, and he gave her a small nod, silent but full of meaning. She smiled back, not saying a word. No apology or thank you was needed anymore. They both understood. That evening, Karoline boarded her flight back to America. The view from the airplane window was breathtaking. The ocean stretched endlessly below, silver in the fading light. As the plane rose higher, she thought about how much had changed in just a few days. She had come to London chasing a story about discipline, and ended up finding a story about the human heart. She took out her notebook and began to write again. "Sometimes," she wrote, "the most powerful lessons come from people who say very little. Their silence becomes a voice that speaks to every heart willing to listen." When she landed back in New York, a small group of reporters was waiting at the airport. They wanted to ask her about the guard, about what she had learned, and about how she felt now that her article had become so famous. She smiled kindly and said, "It's not my story anymore. It belongs to everyone who understands what honor means." Then she thanked them and walked away. Over the next few weeks, she appeared on several news programs, but she kept her answers simple. When one host asked her, "Why do you think people reacted so strongly?" she replied, "Because we live in a world full of noise. Everyone is trying to be heard." But that guard reminded us that silence can be just as powerful. It doesn't shout. It simply stands. Her words were replayed across networks, and once again people nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. The British Royal Palace released a short statement as well, without mentioning names. It said, The men and women who serve as royal guards represent centuries of discipline, sacrifice, and respect. We thank all those who recognize the meaning behind their duty. That message made headlines across the world. For many, it felt like a quiet acknowledgement of the moment that had changed so much. In the following months, Karoline continued writing, but her style was different now. Her new stories were filled with warmth, respect, and thoughtfulness. She wrote about quiet heroes, nurses, firefighters, teachers, and soldiers, people who worked silently, giving their best without asking for attention. Her readers loved this new tone. They said her words made them feel calm and inspired. One afternoon, months later, she received a letter in the mail. The envelope had no return address, only a small royal seal in the corner. Inside was a short handwritten note. It said, "Dear Miss Leavitt, thank you for your kind words and for understanding what silence stands for. We serve best when people remember, not when they cheer. I am glad you listened. A Royal Guard." Karoline held the letter to her chest for a long time, smiling through tears. It was the simplest message she had ever received, but it meant more than any award or recognition. She placed it in a small wooden box on her desk, the same desk where she had written her first apology. Her story continued to be shared online, even years later. Teachers used it in schools, writers quoted it in essays, and families told it at dinner tables. It became one of those rare moments that reminded people how much good could come from understanding, rather than judgment. And somewhere in London, behind the tall gates of Buckingham Palace, a soldier still stood guard. The tourists still came, the flashes still went off, and the noise of the world still surrounded him. But among those crowds were people who watched quietly now, not to make him move, but to honor his stillness. Some even whispered softly, "Thank you." Karoline returned to London a year later to visit once more. She stood by the same place where everything had begun. The city was as beautiful as ever, but now it felt like an old friend. As she looked at the guards again, she thought about how one sentence had connected two nations and countless hearts. She smiled and whispered, "For the ones who can't stand anymore." Then she placed a small white flower at the edge of the gate before walking away. She didn't take pictures or write anything down. She didn't need to. The story was complete, not in words but in silence. And that silence spoke louder than anything else.